So this morning, the sermon is going to be something a little bit different. It's going to be a collaborative sermon between me and Meredith Barber, our intern, our ministerial intern here at the Church of the River. She and I have each picked a question along the same theme, and we're each going to answer each question. So you'll get to hear both of our thoughts. The first question is, what is something that Americans remember, in our cultural memory, even though the way that we remember it isn't really how it happened? In January of 2020, my wife surprised me with a trip to Disney World. It's kind of funny. We managed to go to Disney World right at the beginning of 2020 and go to Italy a few months before that, right before those became two places that were super inaccessible in the pandemic. And we hit them both. So Sandra and I were walking around Disney World and walking around, and both of our feet were getting tired, and so we saw this place called the Hall of Presidents. And we thought, well, we'll go in there, and if nothing else, it looks like we'll be able to sit down for a minute. So we went into this room and we sat down, and in this place they put on this little show, and they showed a video about how great our country is and how heroic and wise and selfless our presidents were and are. And then the screen went away and the stage was filled with presidential robots. Right, there are these lifelike mannequins of every president that we have ever had. And I personally thought that they looked like something out of a horror movie, but I am told that this was very impressive technology when Disney World opened 50 years ago. And so the presidents all sort of look and nod, and then the robot of the current president kind of gets to step forward and give part of his inauguration speech. And it's funny, the video didn't mention Trump at all, but he did get to have his robot on stage, and Sandra and I sat there watching Robo-Trump give his speech, and the excitement in the room was palpable, right? The people around us were into it, and they were excited and energized. And, I would guess that Sandra and I, as two liberals, were probably in the minority in that room, but we're also not immune to this sort of thing, right? We may not respond to the Disney robots, but we do love to listen to the musical Hamilton. And Hamilton, just like the show at Disney World, presents this picture of America, and especially America's founding, that is, incontrovertibly glorious and heroic, right? It paints this picture that's such a part of our country's culture, such a part of our collective memory that we don't question it, right? The memory that declares that America is the land of freedom and opportunity and equality for everybody, and always has been. When, of course, the founding of our country was more complicated than that. As Frederick Douglass pointed out in our reading this morning, when our country was founded, not everybody was free or equal. When America was founded, only white men, and only certain white men, had the right to vote. And not all of the people living here had any kind of freedom. At the time of our country's founding, hundreds of thousands of people were being held as slaves. So the history of our country, it's not just, this story about people who love freedom and equality working as hard as they can to make everybody as free and equal as possible. We had and have people who are like that. But some of the people who are lauded in our history books might be better described as people who were pretty sure they liked the ideas of freedom and equality, but who struggled to decide if they liked those things in reality. And it isn't hard, right, to make the case that our country is still in that place where not everybody is as free and equal as everyone else. Our country is still plagued by racism and other forms of oppression, and many of those oppressions are still entrenched in our systems of government. The truth of where we were and where we are is very complicated. And this gets especially true and especially sort of difficult for our community when we talk about our involvement as Unitarian Universalists, and specifically the involvement of Unitarians in the founding of our country. Two of our founding fathers, who later became president, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, were both Unitarians. Of all the presidential robots on the stage that day, 5 of them represented Unitarians. As a side note, I'm going to name 3 of the Unitarian presidents over the course of this morning. If anybody can show up at coffee hour and name all 5 Unitarian presidents, you will get a prize. And all of these Unitarians, they were complicated figures, men who did a great deal of good and also a great deal of harm. Adams and Jefferson both signed the Declaration of Independence, and they also both allowed or participated in the institution of slavery. Unitarians were involved in the glorious foundation of this country, and we were also complicit, if not actively involved, in the unjust oppression that was happening at the same time. And this issue has continued to be complicated. You know, when Frederick Douglass made that speech, elsewhere in the speech, he talks about the Fugitive Slave Act. And that the Fugitive Slave Act was one of the people who really enforced it. One of the people who really made that happen was President Millard Fillmore, also a Unitarian. And we need to understand this, not because it makes us feel bad, but because we need to understand the reality of our own history. We need to understand our involvement in our country's history. We need to understand this if we ever hope to understand our present or to understand ourselves.
When I thought about this question, one of the first things that came to mind was the history of voting rights in this country. I think there is a narrative among some Americans that after the Civil War, the slaves were free and everyone was treated equally. And while I think those of us listening right now realize that's not the case, America's collective memory is powerful, and combating collective misremembering is no small thing. The right to vote and to make our voices heard in this country has always been complicated. I didn't learn until I was in middle school that for a long time, the only people who could vote, who could elect leaders that made laws about their lives, were white men who owned property. That's a very small group of people to hold a lot of power. Eventually, amendments were made to the Constitution to free slaves and to enfranchise black men. However, Jim Crow laws were very swift, particularly in the South, at stripping away these freedoms that should have been guaranteed under the law, including the right to vote. There were literacy tests, poll taxes, property ownership requirements that were instituted to keep people of color and poor people from exercising rights that were rightfully theirs. It was an extremely long road toward equality, and I think one could even make the argument that we haven't gotten there yet. Dr. King and thousands of others worked and organized and marched and sang and prayed across the country, working tirelessly for change. Those of you that came of age at this time may have even been a part of this movement. And though America certainly remembers this, it too is through the lens of what we want to believe about who we are as a people. Too many forget that Dr. King was hated during his lifetime, terrorized by the FBI, even encouraged to end his life. And though he's the person we grew up learning about in school, the civil rights movement was made possible by so many others who worked tirelessly for change. I remember seeing pictures in school of the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, all in black and white. I didn't learn until this year that we were shown black and white photos intentionally to make it all seem like it was such a long time ago, when in reality, most of these events took place during my parents' lifetimes. The Voting Rights Act was eventually created to enforce protections that should have already been guaranteed, making these discriminations at the polls illegal. It took years of dedication from activists and pressure on the government to lead to action. But we still have a ways to go. In America, it's still not as easy to vote as it should be. We still see rampant voter suppression across the South especially, long lines, not many voting machines or booths. So why does all this matter? Well, first of all, we live in the shadow of all of this history. What happened then impacts what happens in our future and in our children's futures. We have to remember, too, that there is legitimate cause for anger and frustration and sadness, that some voices still struggle to be heard. These events happened in some of your lifetimes, in my parents' lifetime. Our history of injustice in this country runs long and deep and is far from over. This should be both humbling to us and also motivating. We can always change. We can always do more if we work together. The democratic process and a voice for everyone are also at the heart of our faith as Unitarian Universalists. It's central to how we choose leaders and get things done in our congregations. One of my favorite things to share with people who are new to UUism is that the power really rests with the congregation. This can be incredibly empowering for people who haven't experienced this before. It feels so good to know that your voice matters in the place where you come to worship and to grow. Finally, it's more important that we tell the truth about where we really are as a country than to pretend everything is good and to preserve some ideal we were taught as children. The sooner we deal with what truly is, the sooner it might become what was. Amen. What is our role as Unitarian Universalists in lifting up this distinction between history and memory, and why? I have perfume that I used to wear probably about 5 years ago now. And I distinctly remember hearing about it, going to the store and smelling it. I haven't worn that scent in years, but I saw it again recently and picked up another bottle. And when I smell the rich, sweet notes, it transports me right back to that time in my life. When I was living in Arkansas, working on a ranch, and taking the first little baby steps toward living into the call to ministry, beginning to bloom into the person I am today. It carries with it all the newness, freshness, and excitement I felt at the time, like springtime times 100, something that can't be bottled, that I carry in my heart. We know that scents are tied to memory, but our memories are also overlaid with emotion, with all that has happened between now and then. Our memories are malleable, ever-changing and shifting in subtle ways that we may not even notice. When we remember things, we're often remembering less what actually happened and instead recalling how we felt about it at the time. And of course, our feelings change based on things that have happened since, or things we know now that we didn't know then. So we're really dealing with two realities, the one that happened and the one that we remember happening. In a lot of ways, the perceived reality, or what we think happened, is almost more important in that it's embedded in our hearts and our minds. It lives so deep within us that it can be hard to change. As Unitarian Universalists, we have a free-flowing faith. We are bound by covenants we make to one another, and we work to seek the truth in love, wherever it finds us. So the way I see it, our role, or really our responsibility to each other and to the world around us, is to integrate our collective memories as a nation with what we know to be true, to make the two become one. To lovingly seek the truth will require deep listening to voices that we haven't heard before. It is easier, less painful, more comfortable to believe that everything has always been good in America. We want to believe the best about ourselves, about our ancestors, that we would have been on the right side of history, and that our friends and neighbors would have too. It is better for those in power if the rest of us refuse to ask the hard questions about who has enough or more than enough and who is forced to do without. For once we acknowledge wrongs in one part of our life, it will become second nature to keep going. The floodgates will open and they can't be closed again. We might even find that we're complicit in some of these cycles. We might have to confront the hard truth that it is not possible to live in this world without causing harm in some way. So what are we to do with all of this? Well, I think there's a few things that can help us here. The first one that I try to remember is that no one is perfect. And just because we cause harm doesn't mean we can't also do a lot of good. The second thing I try to remember is that we are not alone. We have a community here to love us and to work with us on all of this. And finally, this work of integrating memories and history, this work of awareness and reflection, of listening to one another, of learning more than we once knew, is the kind of work that helps us to draw closer to God, to Spirit, to the divine, by whichever name we know it. May it be so. Amen.
As people of faith, we do not always have to focus super hard on historical facts, right? And it's true that many of the stories and memories that we revere and that we learn from, be it those stories in the Bible or those stories in our popular culture, often have very little to do with what really happened in history, and I don't think that that makes them any less valuable or any less meaningful. But the reason to lift up this distinction between history and memory is that it allows us to love more, and it allows us to love people more. It humanizes people and allows them to be three-dimensional and whole. We live in this society that demands perfection, right? Our media and our culture are deeply unforgiving of even the smallest flaws a person might have, especially if that person is a well-known public figure, let alone major character-defining flaws. It's common to see people's mistakes and imperfections paraded around and brutally criticized in our media or in our social media. And yet, we all have huge flaws and struggles, just like Britney Spears, to the point where I have come to believe that the perfection that our society so commonly demands of us is in and of itself a form of violence. It is an act of dehumanization that runs counter to our values as Unitarian Universalists. You know, I think about the robot president show that I was talking about earlier, and about the people who founded our country, Unitarians or otherwise. And I think, you know, the good that these people did was really good, and the bad that they did was really bad. But you know, if there is some kind of minimum standard of goodness that a person must meet in order to not be thought of as evil and worthy of scorn, I worry that many of our country's founders, including the Unitarians, may fall short of that standard. And so our spiritual work, then, is to recognize that most people, in some way, at some point, fall below that standard. The challenge of our faith is to see both the history and the memory and let ourselves have love and compassion for the people who really lived, not for the Disney robot caricatures of those people. And when we do that work, when we push through memory and into history, but keep the memory with us, when we do that work past the pictures that have been painted in our minds and towards a more complete picture of a human being, that is the work of our faith, because it allows people to be people. And in doing so, it restores their dignity and their humanity. I believe that we should have some kind of love in our hearts for all of the people who have come before us, including the people who founded this country. But if you really love somebody, then it has to be okay to see all of that person, including the things that are very, very difficult to see. Otherwise, that isn't love, it is abuse. As people of faith, we have to allow ourselves to see the complicated humanity in everyone. We are a people of love. We are a loving faith, and seeing the full picture of what was and is allows us to love more fully. It allows us to extend more compassion, not less, to our fellow community members, to the people in our world, to the people we remember fondly or not, and ultimately to ourselves. Amen.